So thank you for coming, welcome to the ICA. Super delighted to welcome artist Ned Acosta and Louise O'Kelly, who is director of Block Universe, which has been going on all of this week and has been amazing. We really enjoyed having Martin Spangberg here on Wednesday night and continues. None the least with Ned's performance tomorrow night at Dave Roberts Art Foundation, Disco Tropic, which we're going to hear about today. So, as usual, we've got about 45 minutes to an hour, and I think there will definitely be chance for questions.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and as Rosalie mentioned, we've been doing performances across the week in various institutions as part of Block Universe. Super happy to have Niv here, who'll be performing tomorrow 8 p.m. Show is already sold out, which is great news. I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about the work you'll be showing tomorrow, Disco Tropic, Alien TV Talk Show, which is part of a larger series. So maybe if you want to give us some insight into some of the ideas behind Disco Tropic, and in particular the work you're showing tomorrow and the context for it.
Absolutely. So Disco Tropic, which we have several videos to show you. Disco Tropic started as a research project. I was looking for sort of black representation in science fiction, disco, astrophysics, and wanting to sort of mount a project that addressed that intersection, right? The intersection of the Black American experience among those genres. And wanting essentially to find who our ancestors were in this, and also essentially contribute to the conversation on Afrofuturism. And if you're not familiar with that term, sort of Afrofuturism, futurism, I'm sure it's already sort of self-explanatory, but it's just the ideology around creating a foundation for sort of the representation and the continued representation of Black folks in the future, right? So when I was doing this research, I was sort of hitting a lot of walls, finding that a lot of the films out there that had Black characters in them, just left me unsatisfied because either the character was dead in the first 20 minutes or was the alien that was evil or somehow it's just invisibilized. So like in the movie Alien, the alien who's behind the mask is a Black man. His name is Balaji Badejo. And this is sort of like this is what happens in Hollywood, or at least in films that I was researching, right? And so my whole thing was to sort of essentially find a location for all of these topics, and then also bring people who are activating Afrofuturism in their own work into the work, so that we could create a history together, so that we could create a language together.
Yeah, because I think there's a really nice play with when we were first talking about the work and what you would bring to London. I guess we kind of had an overarching theme for the festival, which is the future perfect, and it's looking at that idea of what is the future perfect, or kind of in terms of performance, what is the future body, or is it an immaterial body, or is it how do we relate to these different kind of modes of being? And I think kind of particularly in the current day and age that we're in, our relationship to ourselves online and how we present ourselves and the construction of identity, which I think is really an important topic in terms of your work and what you're exploring there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about essentially furthering and progressing the conversation on Black presence, right? Like it's a very fertile conversation in the US right now with all the visibility around activism, Black Lives Matter, all these things. These are things that I've been addressing in my work my entire career, but now there's a bit of more attentiveness in terms of the audience that comes into the space and are interested in engaging in a Black space, or space that is centering Blackness, right?
And I think even in terms of looking at like your kind of career as a whole, and in terms of the work that you've been developing from the Disco Tropic series, I think we'll return to that in a second, but we were talking briefly before about the work you did immediately prior, which was another series called Denzel. And if you want to fill people in a little bit about the subject matter for that and your thinking behind
so
it.
does everybody know who Denzel Washington is? It's a pretty like household name, okay?
Hollywood actor. Yeah.
Oh, you know, Hollywood actor, lots of Oscars, that guy. So Denzel Washington is like one of those household names, and so the reason why I'm asking you is because it is sort of how I was sort of perceiving Black masculinity my entire life, right? So he fulfills this like archetype of Black masculinity. And so me sort of coming into my own masculinity and wanting to define that and contextualize it and also provide a frame for how to describe essentially, I guess, my identity at the end of it. But, you know, Denzel being sort of like this like stoic, strong, smart and thinks on his toes. I mean, at least the characters that he fulfilled, but then at the same time, as much as like we love Denzel and he is a powerful actor, he's gotten awards for it, a lot of the roles that he's fulfilled have been very stereotyped, right? And that's not to say that he didn't do an amazing job. It's still a symptom of how Hollywood holds Black bodies, right? So I was trying to explore what that like play with that Black masculinity and see if there was any relation, and if there were any relation, to explore that. If I'm also exploring the complete oppositeness of us both, right? So I'm being queer and trans and young and whatever, feeling kind of opposite from Denzel. So I made this series called Denzel, sort of exploring Black masculinity and also mortality and dealing with, how the deaths of Black bodies and how sort of the violence that we experience, right? And trying to deal with that essentially and meditate on that through movement. And Denzel, I mean, the conversations were just the most interesting part, right? In terms of how I was developing it and developing the idea of the Black archetype, right? And so my mom has intersected with that process as well. I think I mounted about 5 installations of Denzel, and the most recent one was called I Shot Denzel, where I am essentially exhausting myself through physical activity for about 50 minutes. And eventually my mom joins me on stage, where she's joined by a 9-piece orchestra, and she sings this song by an Spanish artist, Camilo Sesto. And the song is sort of about an unrequited love, and so there's a bit of an Oedipus moment there. But I love working with my mom because I also think that she frames and contextualizes my Black masculinity, if that makes sense. And my masculinity, if you don't know me, is quite. I'm kind of averse to masculinity. I have a lot of issues with the socialized idea of masculinity. I think it can be quite violent and unfortunately really stifles people's growth and has, as we've seen, become sort of like a site for a lot of violence, right? And so my whole thing is wanting to essentially come to terms with identifying as masculine, right? And not wanting to be related immediately to that depiction of masculinity that I hate, and wanting to bring more femininity into my masculinity because I'm not afraid of femininity, right? Or femme identity, if that makes sense.
And how does that play out as well in terms of the different performances you do and the collaborations that you do? Because obviously, we talked about your mum being in Denzel, and Nave's mum's also in his performance tomorrow evening. She's the TV talk show host for the evening. And, I want to talk about, apart from that family connection and how, your identity really is, a huge part of what the performances are also, but also how you collaborate with different performers. So, this piece, maybe we can play a clip in a moment, that you collaborate with different performers in New York, and now that you're in London, you've invited different people to collaborate with you here. And I think that's a really nice way of connecting with the place, but maybe you can talk about how important collaboration is for you in these performances.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love building community. Community is sort of how I identify my work. It's community building. And I wouldn't be able to do half of the stuff that I do without the people that are in my life, right? And I also love to learn from other people through conversation, through developing work together, and just having intensive periods of time in a room together. And so for me, I'm just constantly wanting to fill that space with new energy, right? And so this talk show has been a platform not just to essentially center my mom and give her her own platform so that she can shine bright like a diamond like she is, but also to invite other artists in the local community who would not otherwise be in the room, right? Or at least in the room on that stage with that lighting. And that is super, I mean, it's really impactful for me because I love providing opportunities. I also love to, invite people who know better than I do about the area or about, the context on race in the area. And the people I've invited are people who are activists, who are artists, and are certainly crucial in the conversations around race in the UK, and wanting to essentially just give them 10 to 15 minutes to explore whatever it is that they're wanting to do. And for me, Discotropic is really, it's not just pragmatic, it's also fantastical. It's really important to play. It's important to activate fantasy, to be able to live through struggle, right? Play is important. And so also challenging my mom to play. She plays all the time, but now I want people to see how she plays, because so much of how she plays has taught me how to play and live through struggle and develop my imagination and be invested in my imagination. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, because that's a very, I suppose it's playing with that like improvisation in a sense.
Yes.
So, when you bring in these other elements that you don't control, it's like how you play with the space and actually in how you respond to each other, and you create a different environment. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other artists that you'll be working with tomorrow? Yeah,
so Rumbi Mautsi, she is from Ghana. She's been in the UK, predominantly her whole life. She's a mother of a 5-year-old now, Samora. And she is just like a radiant mom. She's like, glory. I mean, she's gorgeous. She's also an actor. And that's sort of been one side of her artistry, but then the other side of it has been writing and, sort of performing art. And so she's bringing a piece about the sun and how it's related to the womb, and how the sun created life and the womb creates life. And so she's creating this sort of bridge between those two ideas, which I'm really excited about. And then the other act will be an activist. Her name is Rochelle, and her friend Serena. I'm not as familiar with Serena because she's brought her into it, but Rochelle is an activist. She works a lot in essentially with community organizations to develop better opportunities for education for people of color in the UK, as well as health care and food and so forth. And she has big dreams for creating, sort of programming in the future. And she also happens to be a singer. Right. And her friend a percussionist, so they'll be going in tomorrow a cappella, doing some Orisha songs, which is of the Yoruba religion, and then we'll be also joined by artist Fanny Sosa, who is a really close friend of mine, and she is getting her PhD in twerking, which is super exciting. And she will be having a cooking segment with Mom. They'll be meeting each other essentially for the first time and cooking their own meals on the set. And then she will also twerk with me 1,205 times for one twerk for every victim of police violence in the United States last year who were unarmed. So
that's kind of incredible. So I've seen you've done that piece before, but presumably with a different number. Was it last year?
Yeah, so the first time I did it, it was a smaller number because I had done it before the year had closed.
Right.
So it was only 1,000 twerks. And now it's 1,205 after the tally of 2015.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
that's what we have recorded.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there that I want to talk about in terms of kind of your expanded practice and life. But maybe first as well, you can talk a little bit about twerking in itself and actually how you use it as a tool and the durational element that you work with. And just maybe speak a bit about, I guess, that the kind of physical activity and the kind of, I guess the intensity of doing something like that for a long period of time.
Right.
Yeah.
So twerking, I mean, I think that twerking for me was the foundation for disco tropic in terms of movement or movement vocabulary. We're sort of utilizing in our world of disco tropic, twerking has the ability to govern planetary movement. And I like to think that our bodies are planets. And twerking is sort of like this, it's absurd to a certain eye, it's beautiful to a certain eye, it's sexual to a certain eye. It really is so vastly received in diverse ways, right? Like it's really just, it depends on the person. But twerking, when you do it for as long as I do in this piece, which is I think for the first 25 minutes of this piece we're twerking.
Yeah.
And so, you know, essentially through repetition, dissolving meaning, creating a new meaning. When you see something repetitively over and over again, you have prescribed something onto it initially, right? And as you see it more and more, there might be other things that jump out to you. And eventually, by the end of the cycle or rotation of repetition, it's probably going to mean something different to you, because not only has it been happening for a while, you've also been experiencing a body, a person, going through this labor, right? So it also evokes you know, a strain of empathy. You feel bad. You want to take care of them. You know, people are tired after watching me twerk. You know, and that, I mean, that already sort of has this like, you know, ephemerality, and like it is, you know, pulling on this, I don't know how to describe it, just like trying to pull on what people are trying to project onto the situation and trying to play with how people perceive it, right? And so repetition really allows that in a lot of ways.
It's also like the energy and labor of performance, isn't it? It's, you know, kind of, you're working hard.
Yes.
Maybe we can play that first clip now. Let's see.
I think it's over here.
Okay, I'll leave you to do it. Oh yeah, that's your screensaver. can continue to let that play a little bit. And I mean, this work as well, this was in January in the Westbath Centre.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I know you were lucky enough to have 5 months to develop the work in.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about those different scenes and what's happening here as well?
Yeah, so the whole piece is about an hour long, and for the first 20 minutes we're twerking in our own rooms in the space, and there are 4 performers, Monster Black, Ashley Brockington, Justin Allen, and myself, and then our DJ, who you hear the sound, she's mixing that live, and she's up on the balcony where the spiral staircase is. But yeah, it's very sectional, and I like that. I like doing that. I've been critiqued on this before, but I really don't care.
in terms of...
Just people have been like, your work is very segmented, but it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
I sort of think in this way, and it's sort of just always been the case for my work. I can't seem to let it loose. But I really try to sort of make this section sort of flow into each other. So we start with 20 minutes of twerking, and then Ashley crawls across the space with a long train, repeating sort of a monologue out of this the Star Wars Holiday Special where Diane Carroll plays Mermea. In this segment where we're visiting the Chewbacca's family. And it's very sexualized and fetishized, but we sort of deconstructed it, and I allowed her to sort of play with it. She's an actor, and so she just really held that and dealt with that. She's also 43, so there's a bit of a generational difference. I loved sort of meeting in the middle in terms of how we could sort of present this. And then that's followed by this section, which is we call it the doo-wop section. And then we also I constructed a song essentially that we start singing based off of Sun Ra's music, which is this like he's like the pioneer of Afrofuturism. And if you haven't checked out his work, I would definitely check out Space is the Place, which is a great and weird documentary with Sun Ra. But basically we sing this song that I created where we say we're traveling the space waves. Right. We're traveling the bass waves, and we literally are just repeating that for about 10 minutes, and it gets sort of swells, and we're accompanied by a guitar and a track, and then that sort of fizzles out, and there's a portion where they speak, they repeat these words. I consider myself reflective of you, reflective of you, reflective of you. Consider yourself defective for not seeing me. I ain't going nowhere. And so they do this beautiful moment that the other dancers do on the stage, where they're just repeating and just sort of slowly falling into different positions. Then I come out with this headdress that's very lit, and I do a twerking solo where I'm just like twerking upside down, I'm twerking on the ground, I'm twerking, and a little bit of voguing, and then we sort of end with this we play Follow the Leader. Very simple game of Follow the Leader at the very end,
and in terms of, you're looking at all of these different sci-fi references and musical references. I know the show tomorrow evening you have done in tribute in a way to Prince.
Oh yes.
So do you want to, tell us a little bit more about that homage? And obviously his untimely death recently.
Prince, that's just been on the mind. I cried when I found out that he passed. It's just like so unexpected. He also happens to be one of my idols, and also a pioneer in Afrofuturism in a lot of ways. And for me, I needed to sort of find a space for him. I don't think that we're necessarily explicitly addressing his death, but his presence is in the room. We have purple theme. We're calling it Purple Prince Womb. And I think we're getting a Prince jacket, and we're going to hang that up somewhere. But that's the extent of how Prince is existing. But, of course, our ancestors in Afrofuturism are very much braided into the fabric of the show. But, the piece or the show opens with the Alicia Keys video that I'm in, which is hilarious, and also it was my mom's choice. And she's dancing along to it, which is really lovely. But I love just to be like, hey, these are the people in the world that I'm referring to, or that I have as a reference. In terms of our Afrofuturism, right? Who are activating this, I feel, are doing a great job of it, or I feel some sort of kinship with.
Yeah. And maybe we can move then on to talking a little bit more about how, I mean, your artistic practice, I think, is one facet of maybe your overall, I don't know, life practice in a way, and you know, kind of the different things that drive you and that you're interested in bringing into the world, in a sense. I know we've talked a little bit, I mean, Niv is also very well known for his activism and his intention in creating change within the arts community, but also the world at large. But I guess the arts community, which is kind of your home in a sense. Something that we were, you know, talking about and hoping to, and we'd really like to bring to London again, is Niv also does these structural racism training courses, which is, I guess, very practical, hands-on training for people working in the cultural industries that address these issues. Maybe if you want to tell us a little bit more about that practice and how the two kind of complement each other and work in tandem.
I mean, I have always been angry, and I've been trying to figure out ways to manage that, and making art is one, right? And anger is multifaceted, right? It's not one-dimensional, and that's what's unfortunate, I think, about the general perception of anger. But basically, anger can be very productive. And I've been wanting to essentially not necessarily divorce myself from the abstract space, but wanting to add on to the abstract space. What I mean by that is the art world, right? Like, or the art space, the performance space feels like it has to sort of accommodate this abstract feel, right? But then I'm also like, well, if I'm here and my body is in this room, there's something already inherently political about this, particularly the institutions that I'm navigating are predominantly white institutions and white-walled spaces. And so there's a bit already of my presence is already challenging the room, right? And I have felt that, people have told me that explicitly. And I, you know, the fuckery ensues, but basically I am like trying to change the conversation on race and trying to create solutions instead of just be angry, right? Because my anger is probably killing me. And so I want to, so through my own activism, so I do this structural racism training for cultural producers. I worked in philanthropy last year to develop an analysis and, you know, essentially create this training for people who are creating culture. And that includes people in art institutions, but it also includes community organizations full of activists who are interested in the betterment of the neighborhood or the community. And so my whole purpose is essentially create a platform for those people to be in the room together, because they're often not, which is unfortunate, right? You'd think that a building being in a neighborhood would want to engage with the neighborhood, but often we don't see that model. And so for me, I was wanting to essentially open up the walls and also enhance the conversation. So the structural racism training is solutions based. It's meant to catalyze action. So you know, it's very informative. We talk about how policy impacts people's lives. I know that art doesn't necessarily want to address policy all the time, but I'm tired of leaving myself at home when I go into art spaces, right? I want to be able to bring my full self into the space. And so me activating this conversation is a way of bringing myself, my whole self, into my work. And so, you know, my work is basically, in total has been a platform and been inclusive of Black people, and only Black people. And that's been intentional, and people have had issues with that, and some people are like, yes, some people are like tokenizing us or whatever it is. It's very different, it's received very differently, but basically the structural racism training is one thing that I can now say, okay, you want my dance, you can also have this structural racism training. And I, you know, sort of, it's a bit of a cornering process, because I'm saying, you have to tell me why not, or you have to do it, right? And so now I'm using the leverage that I have in these institutions to say, okay, like, you don't just get my like pretty dance, you also get the very, very tough and very good conversation on race, and also how you might be contributing to structural barriers in your community. You know, I've worked with a lot of institutions at this point in that regard, and it's been really fruitful, and it's really like saving my life. Because so much of what I was missing prior to this interaction was, you know, being seen. Being recognized, right? Like fully recognized for everything that I'm bringing to the table. So I'm so happy to be able to provide this. and it's going well. I'm really
Right.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I feel like the conversation around that, I think, that is very strong in the States in terms of, issues of race. And I think we were talking about how in the UK it can be a very different conversation because it's essentially a different country with a different history and how those relate. So, I'm really interested to kind of continue that more and talk about
Me too.
that within the arts in London. But I thought something that, even in terms of, this very practical training in relationship to your arts practice, I know we talked about this idea of like bringing people together in one space and actually, the transformative power of having groups of people. And actually, I think something that you talk a lot about is community, which, I think you kind of seem to see it as like a very distinct and strong force for good in the world, whereas I think my experience of maybe communities of artists or whatever in the UK is a very loose social thing, as opposed to maybe how you kind of see the generative power of community.
Yeah,
if you want to talk about maybe how you actively create communities.
Yeah, I'm making communities through collaborating with people. I'm also making communities through conversation. And the structural racism training is also helpful in that when I'm coming to the environment or the community, I'm reaching out to community organizations that directly impact the work and the conversation. And I'm collecting data, statistical data, to be able to say, hey, institution, these are your numbers.
Yeah.
I'm not just making shit up. That provides an opportunity to actually meet people who are invested and have a stake in the environment or that institution or that community. And so that also is very generative in terms of building, right? Like I am saying, hey, I have this toolkit and I want you to use it. So how do we get it so that you can actively use this and continue to pressure the institutions that you need to essentially accept you into their walls, right?
Yeah.
But community being, it is like protests, congregating at churches, performances are just, if we all decided on a collective issue, right, that we were all like, we're gonna go figure this out right now together. With the amount of resources probably in this room, we could probably make a dent in it, right? Because we could do this. Like if you roll deep, if you squat up, it's like really impactful thing, right? Like you are able to say, you're not just letting me down. If you're letting people down, you're letting all of us down, right? And that often puts people in the hot seat, and they have to address it a bit more precisely and in a better way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that we talked about, whether it's gender or race, that, in the world at large, I think, when there is a default position that, for example, like the white male or whatever, that sort of trope that, I think unless you're having a conversation about it, it's so easy just to kind of continue as you were.
Right. I think that's probably true for white people, right? Whereas like as a black person, I have to deal with a lot of oppression.
Right.
And I know we're like in the 21st century, but like you guys, it's still happening. People are still being shot on the street. I still have like a lot of barriers to paying rent, to getting employment, to healthcare. There are a lot of barriers, and it's invisible to a lot of people. And that's what keeps those barriers up. Meanwhile, people who are suffering from and dealing with the oppression of these barriers are like, what the fuck? Like I'm dying, literally, or my people are suffering, or I need to be able to get my kids to school. Something as simple as transportation is a structural barrier. If you don't have access to transportation, how are you supposed to get to your job? And then if you can't get to your job, how are you supposed to make money? And if you can't make money, how are you supposed to pay rent? So it's really, the structural racism training is about having a holistic lens, right? To think of all the aspects that impact our lives, every single one. And because it is a chain, you can't just address one side without considering all the aspects, right? So when I'm thinking of working with institutions, I have to deal with hiring people, making sure that people are fed and they feel like their time is not being wasted, and I'm honoring them. And I also feel like I can still feed myself and pay rent and that sort of thing. So I'm constantly negotiating, right? Because institutions are most of the time not ready for that. They're not ready for me to be like, no, this is what it takes for me to be in your show. And if I can't have these parts, then the piece suffers. The work itself is not going to be complete, or it's not going to be what you want it to be or what we all want it to be.
Yeah.
Because I can't bring my full self, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm having to compartmentalize myself, then it's probably going to show up in the
Right.
work that I'm producing as well. Yeah.
Great. And I might just, we could segue into just like playing a little clip here, and because I want to open up to the audience soon for questions, because I'm sure there's a lot of conversation that could happen here around the work.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, this can be maybe like our fade out, but
I'll put it on right now, and then we
if
can
you
talk.
want to kind of maybe just tell people what this is.
Oh,
that they're
this is
watching
my partner and I took a holiday to Mexico, and it was like the first holiday we've ever taken together because we finally got some money. And so I love to twerk at the shore because I find the connection of land and sea very energizing. And I don't know, I think it's like a very spiritual thing to be able to face the ocean and just release your body actively.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't know anything about twerking, it's not just in Miley Cyrus videos. It is, it can be very, I don't know if you do yoga, so Kundalini is sort of your root chakra, right? That's where like your pelvic area is, and there's a lot of energy there, and that energy can get really stale if we don't actively shake it or move it or bring heat out of it, right? And so twerking actively sort of releases that area. We hold a lot of tension in that area, in our asses and in our hips, and we're taught to do that. We're taught to tuck it in, put it away, and I'm averse to that. I'm tired of putting it away, so I'm actively shaking it free. And so for me, it's not just health. It's good for your digestion. It's really good for sex. It's really good for reproduction. And not to mention good exercise as well.
Well, I think, that's something I think about movement in general is, what you're talking about is this sort of like transcendent experience through physical movement. And I think, I really appreciate that something in your performance is about this, bringing this like positive energy actually to a space. And, all of the, barriers and difficulties that you're talking about and want to address, I really appreciate that you create this positive space and positive energy within which, like you talked about, maybe it's a fantastical possibility, but within which something beautiful can also happen and that the audience can experience. And I think that's pretty special.
Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask me? Please don't be shy, yes?
First, also, could you share a little bit about your own history as a dancer, like where these moves are?
Oh yeah. I've been dancing my whole life. I started with West African dance and Afro-Caribbean dance when I was 4 or 5 years old at the community center near our home in Manhattan. And basically through that, I just like developed a keen sensibility around my body and relationship to my own body. And that's something my mom also very much encouraged. And she's also a mover and a singer and a painter. She's an artist in her own respect. And so after that, I went to the Martha Graham School of Contemporary Dance. So I studied classical dance. And I also studied choreography and dance at the California Institute of the Arts in Los Angeles. And then after that, I started choreographing. I like to say that my first real dance class was a composition class. So the first time I was really introduced to dance, like dance, was through creating dance, like through finding out how to develop a vocabulary, your own vocabulary, So I had already so many like feelings about being bossy and like just really excited about like directing people and creating movement with other people. I didn't know this, I was 12, but and then I just sort of continued, like Denzel was like my reintroduction into creating work professionally. I guess I hope that answered your question, but that's like basically, have navigated the underground dance world. I've also navigated the, more visible dance world. I've danced professionally for people several times in different cities and different venues as well. So I've done that circuit as well.
I wonder how you see white people coming into this whole issue, because I'm a visual artist, particularly printmaker, and I've over the last couple of years I've become sort of totally figurative. My studio's in Tottenham, which is a very multicultural, multi-everything area. And I've exhibited at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre, which was the first Afro-Caribbean museum in the UK, I think. So it's very lively and it's great. But it's kind of quite, it sort of exercises my mind quite a lot about how I work with woodcuts, but I also draw. And I'm sure you know the default position in a woodcut is black and white. I mean, I do use a sort of colour now, but it's sort of, and I'm working on a black and white piece at the moment with, well, it's to do with soldiers, so and I'm finding it quite tricky representing, and obviously I'm quite tentative about it. I realise I felt sort of weighed in with hobnail boots on. Sort of how to represent a black soldier in a black and white. I mean, I want this particular piece to be black and white for other reasons, because it's about bringing down deep dark hole. So it's kind of quite. And it's not a conversation you particularly have here. I mean, I have, black friends and as I say, I'm sort of connected with the community through the Bernie Grant Centre.
I mean, we're always in discourse. It's not, for me, I'm fighting for racial equity, right? I'm fighting for giving people the option to choose, right? Really, at the end of the day, I want to be able to have the choice. And so, in terms of your question or your point, I guess I'm just thinking, like, I wouldn't also be able to do half the shit that I do without the white institutions, right? Or their money, right? And that's like, I have to acknowledge that. And I have to acknowledge that it takes Louise to be like, hey, I love your work. I'm going to bring you here and I want you to be here in your full self. And that, it's like, it's not that I wouldn't, I think that it would be different if it were my world. You know what I mean? But this is the world that we're working with. And my partner is white, and this is a conversation we have constantly. We've been together for 4 years, and she's with a black activist. And so this is like always a topic. But, we've gone through many versions of this conversation. But she, like we like to say, woke. She's woke. She's accepted the circumstances. She's accepted that there are aspects of her presence that can sometimes contribute to some oppressive circumstance, and has maybe historically, or maybe her family, or has had to deal with that history, right? Her family being historically slave owners, for instance, in the U.S. So that's what we face. We have to deal with that. And I am not interested in segregation. I'm not interested in continuing to create separatist spaces. I'm really trying to be more inclusive. My training isn't just white facing, it isn't just black facing. It's meant to involve everyone who needs to be there. And so I don't know if that's answering your question, but in terms of like,
the curator who is black, the director is black, obviously, most people there are black. But I've never been made to feel at all
that's
different
great.
or separate at all.
And that's beautiful. I'd want more spaces like that. Trying to create more.
I don't know whether that's a London thing or a British thing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Obviously we're thinking a lot about America, but so this is now jumping.
No, totally. No, you're right. You're right. This is obviously like the American context over here, but
well, I want to sort of say, it's really great hearing what you say. It's really interesting. There's a few points that you mentioned that I'm going to kind of go back to, as in, I'm a London-based artist, and I do political art with an activist. I'm a Pakistani background, with red hair. So, I've been to art school and I've been part of art exhibitions in London. There's a lot of racism, equally, probably more possibly in America, or equally just as bad. Or, this is such an imperialist city that, I'm not sort of being condescending towards you, but I think you kind of brush off it and like, you know, it's kind of different, you know, it's not different, it's just as bad or much worse really, racism, you know, and you know, to the point where, you know, these conversations of racism, like now it's become a bit more cool to talk about it, I suppose, but still it's a big taboo, right, like as in like, you know, I mean, like I'm part of like, you know, before me, like activist kind of art groups of black and brown people artists talking about the sort of extremeness of the racism, you know. I mean, you know, you're nodding along very nicely and pleasantly here, but I'd be like, you know, I mean, because...
Well,
you know,
maybe just to qualify my point, when I said that it's different here, I wasn't referring to the fact that it doesn't exist here or that it is less or more bad than in the States, but I was referring to a conversation myself and Niv had when we were discussing his structural racism training. So when he's looking at structural racism in the States, there's, you know, all this data that he's talking about. There's like certain contexts, I guess, for racism in the States, and that is to do with the history there. And what you're talking about in the UK is, there's different things happening here because of, you know, the different post-colonial histories we have, you know, what London, the kind of cultural makeup of London versus,
you know, again, you know, it's a bit, using, I mean, what Noah has got, you know, his point is so on point, really. But like, you know, and it completely parallels with the sort of black and brown artist struggles in this country. And you know, to say it's different, I think you're almost sort of saying, well, it could be like, you know, it could be less worse, or you know, something else a bit more. You know,
I'm saying there's different factors that contribute to it. That's my point.
Actually, I mean, they're all kind of, you know, this is when, you know, you're not familiar with that, unfortunately, because not unfortunately, well, you know, fortunately for yourself as a white person who, you know, who has an easier time with the arts than you do, and there are stats and figures to show how, you know, how much easier it is for like, white people to kind of make their way through into art education, teaching jobs, or even inside the institution. So, you know, it's, you know, you've got to, like, I mean, again, this is like a huge, bigger topic for me to kind of deconstruct just sitting here right now, you know, because, I mean, you're just kind of downplaying the sort of struggle of the, you know, and that's what you've got, but this is something
I'm fully, like, I fully acknowledge the struggle that is there, and I don't mean to in any way downplay it. I'm just saying that I was referring to a conversation that myself and Niv had in terms of the factors that make that up.
We've also like talked a ton, like a ton before I came here, and I feel like we both learned a lot. I feel like you were even saying yesterday that like through conversations, like you've learned a lot about your own positioning in the conversation and in this context. And like for me, the British context is only like it's the same dish just served differently, right? And it's really sometimes troubling to read some of the data because you can't really necessarily trust it depending on the agency it's coming from and that sort of thing. So you sort of just have to find your way to the truth. And that often comes from community organizations that are really actually collecting this data. But, you know, like it is, I think, you know, like I think as much as like there's, the structural racism training could have happened this time, but we didn't have a ton of like resources and the capacity. We were just super stretched thin. But you know, there's already an interest in coming back and trying to really have a more robust collaboration with Louise and Block Universe, so that we can, you know, create a space for that dialogue. And I think, I mean, I trust that Louise is like actually listening to me.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I mean, I think, like you said, you know, it's when I'm inviting you over, it's, you know, it's like fully cognizant of you know what your practice is about and
which is
and
rare. Which is rare. I have to reiterate, it's rare that happens when somebody's like consciously making that decision. Like you have, right? I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yes.
No.
But
maybe if we have time for one more question, and we'll close.
Just maybe to help us understand a little bit more the training, structural racism training, because it's so interesting. Do you have like an example of like an identified problem within an institution? And also the other question is like I'm kind of been considering like arts and dance institutions, but
but there's like there's so many institutions that are contributing to culture, right? Like even philanthropic institutions, right? Or like like I said, like community organizations that are like people who are on the ground doing work in their communities and trying to address like policies that are impacting them specifically. Like I think I heard that something like that happens here, where people like they like collectively address like estate issues, right? Or they can like organize around this. I'm still learning,
Right.
but. Yeah, so basically the training starts with addressing essentially, the history of structural racism, right? Like one example that I like to use is in America, we had Social Security income, which is like sort of welfare or government aid program for people who are lower income or veterans or elderly. And so essentially this was created to give people the opportunity to retire at 65. And it was created in 1945, something like this. And so it was created with the greatest intention to provide people the opportunity to rest after they've worked their entire lives, right? But within that bill, there was also a clause that said people who are agricultural workers or domestic workers were not granted this benefit. And who do we know at that time in the U.S. history were the agricultural or domestic workers? They were all people of color. So this is a racially coded policy. Here we have a very clear example of how government so quickly and so easily can slip in this sort of clause, creating a barrier for people of color to access those benefits. So that's like we talk about the policies, and then we also talk about how policies impact our life, and we talk about like I was saying, like the holistic lens, talking about like how not having housing will impact employment and healthcare and access to childcare and so forth. And so I just try to lay out this like what this structure is, what is structural racism, and we define that, and then we also talk about how that looks in the cultural sector. And I have some statistics that I've gathered just in America around sort of the employment or staff patterns in museums across the nation. And I mean, to no surprise, it's not a surprise to me, but it's 90% white. And the people of color who are employed in these institutions are often janitorial or security. And so here we have if we're ever wondering why there aren't more people of color or artists of color in these spaces, right? Here we have the answer. The answer is that the institution is full of white people, and white people, unfortunately, in these situations are either not open to the idea or just haven't, like you said, can easily overlook it because they don't have to deal with it. They literally don't have to, they're not impacted by it. So that's where we see this sort of like homogenous white male world, because it's also run predominantly by white males. So that's like one way that we're dealing with it. And then sort of the breakdown of the workshop, it turns into a skill share where we talk about our own institutional relationships, and we create a platform for addressing issues. So basically the structural analysis is a set of questions that will lead you to the answer of identifying what a structural barrier is.
But I think what's really positive about the workshop that you do is that it's very much a workshop with people where you're, at the end of it, you're actively trying to find solutions for what people can do to make change and to address those issues.
It was really amazing in Berlin. I did it recently. From that, a white affinity group got started by the loudest white man in the room. And I'm like, I think that those spaces need to exist, because as much as I can occasionally educate somebody, I'm not interested in educating them all of the time. And they need to, you know what I mean? And because it's not my job. And they need to build community around that, around that conversation. And my partners even tried out a few affinity groups. Some of them are problematic, some of them are amazing. I don't personally trust that they're doing all of the work there, but that's a good start, right? And then another person who happened to have a large enough space was like, I'm going to offer this space as a meeting place for people, So now there are meetings happening at this person's house, on a regular basis. And also just connecting the activists in the room to the institution I was presenting in, Kunstwerke. They now are hosting some events there, activist events. Black in Berlin was recently hosted there, where they have critical discourse around being either Afro-German or being Black in Berlin. And that I love. That's like essentially my dream is to be able to catalyze that sort of thing.
And then
that's what can
continue
happen.
on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
planting, so think of it as planting seeds, and people then are in charge of cultivating them. Right.
Great.
Yeah. So should we?
Yeah, let's
Let's do this.
Thank you very much, Niv, for the conversation today.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank
And we're delighted to have you here as well.
Thank you. So I made this trailer for my show just because I was like, I'm so happy to be at the beach. And I was trying to really bring the tropics into the space, because it is called Disco Tropic. But this is me twerking at the shore, being real happy about it. Oh, and the music is created by my collaborator, DJ Tygapaw. We have our own collective called Fake Accent. And she's a part of another collective called Non-Worldwide, but all very POC, very about that life.